The radio operator's hands trembled as he counted the silhouettes appearing on the horizon. 1 carrier, 5 carriers, 10 carriers, 20. He stopped counting at 30 because the numbers didn't make sense anymore. His mind couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. An entire ocean filled with American warships stretching as far as he could see. In that moment, standing in the communications room of a Japanese cruiser on October 24th, 1944, he understood with crystalline clarity that everything they'd been told about American weakness was a lie. The Empire wasn't just losing this war, it had already lost. This is the story of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, where 64 American carriers faced down a desperate Japanese fleet in waters off the Philippines. It's about the moment an entire nation realized the tide had turned so completely that survival itself was no longer guaranteed. But to understand why this battle shattered Japanese confidence so utterly, you need to know what they believed before that horizon filled with enemy ships, the world before the storm. 3 years earlier, I'd been researching Japanese naval doctrine in 1941, and what struck me most was the confidence, not arrogance, genuine, calculated confidence based on what seemed like solid reasoning. Japan's navy had been the pride of the empire, their carriers the most advanced in the world, their pilots the most experienced. When they struck Pearl Harbor, they believed they'd bought themselves time to establish an impregnable defensive perimeter across the Pacific. The plan was elegant: make any American counteroffensive so costly that Washington would eventually negotiate peace, allowing Japan to keep its conquered territories. For a while, it worked exactly as planned. But what Japanese commanders didn't fully grasp, what they couldn't have grasped, was the sheer industrial might they'd awakened. America wasn't just going to rebuild what was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. America was going to build a fleet so massive it would rewrite the rules of naval warfare itself. The creeping realization. By mid-1944, cracks were appearing in Japanese confidence. Island after island fell to American forces. But here's what made Leyte Gulf different from every previous defeat. It wasn't just another tactical loss. It was the moment when Japanese naval officers, standing on their ship decks, saw with their own eyes exactly how outmatched they had become. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the center force, one of 3 Japanese fleets converging on Leyte Gulf. He was a veteran commander who'd survived multiple naval engagements, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what he encountered on October 24th. As his ships pushed through the Sibuyan Sea, American aircraft appeared overhead in waves that seemed endless. The first strike consisted of more planes than his entire fleet's air cover. Then came another wave, and another. For 8 hours straight, his ships endured attack after attack from carrier-based aircraft. Standing on the bridge of his flagship, the massive battleship Yamato, Kurita watched the super battleship Musashi, Yamato's sister ship and one of the 2 largest battleships ever built, absorb hit after hit. The Musashi was designed to be unsinkable, armored so heavily that conventional wisdom said it would take dozens of torpedo and bomb strikes to bring her down. Japanese engineers had built her specifically to withstand exactly this kind of punishment. But the Americans didn't follow conventional wisdom. They just kept coming. The Musashi took 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes over the course of that day. 19 torpedoes. Let that sink in. That's not a battle. That's execution by overwhelming force. When the Musashi finally capsized and slipped beneath the waves in the late afternoon, taking over 1,000 men with her, Kurita understood something fundamental had changed. This wasn't about Japanese tactical errors or American luck. This was about raw, crushing numerical superiority that made tactics almost irrelevant. The arithmetic of desperation. Here's where the numbers become almost surreal. The Japanese had assembled virtually every operational warship they possessed for this battle. 4 carriers, 9 battleships, 20 cruisers, and 35 destroyers. It represented years of construction, the cream of their remaining naval power, the concentrated might of an empire that had once dominated Asian waters. The Americans brought 64 carriers. 64. Not battleships, not destroyers. Carriers. Each one capable of launching dozens of aircraft. Some were the massive fleet carriers like the Essex-class ships, floating cities of steel that displaced over 27,000 tons and carried up to 90 aircraft. Others were the escort carriers, smaller but still formidable, each adding their aircraft to the swarm that would darken the skies over Leyte Gulf. The math was devastating. For every Japanese carrier, America had 16. For every Japanese aircraft, America had 10 or more. And these weren't just numbers in a ledger. They were physical realities that filled the sky and covered the ocean. Japanese lookouts scanning the horizon didn't see individual ships. They saw fleets. They saw task forces that were larger than Japan's entire committed force. They saw an industrial power that had turned war production into something approaching an art form. What terrified Japanese commanders wasn't just losing. They'd lost battles before. What terrified them was the realization that American losses didn't seem to matter. When Japan lost a carrier, it was a national tragedy, irreplaceable, a wound that would take years to heal if it could heal at all. When America lost a carrier, 3 more appeared to take its place. That's not an exaggeration. That's literally what happened throughout 1944. American shipyards were launching new carriers faster than Japan could target them. The moment of truth, October 25th, brought the crisis to its peak. Kurita's force had survived the previous day's air attacks, though badly mauled, and was now approaching its target, the American landing forces in Leyte Gulf. If they could break through and devastate the troop transports and supply ships, they might still salvage something from this operation. Then, just after dawn, they encountered Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was a small group of 6 escort carriers. The smaller, slower carriers used primarily for anti-submarine work and ground support. These weren't the fleet carriers with their heavy armor and powerful air wings. These were essentially cargo ships with flight decks welded on top, protected by just 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. In a straight gunfight, Kurita's battleships and cruisers would obliterate them in minutes. What happened next became one of the most remarkable running battles in naval history. The escort carriers fled, launching every aircraft they had. The destroyers, ships that weighed a tiny fraction of what Japanese battleships displaced, charged directly at Kurita's battle line, firing torpedoes and guns in what should have been a suicidal attack. But here's what changed everything. Those escort carriers kept launching planes, even as Japanese shells bracketed them, even as their crews prepared for the impacts that would send them to the bottom. Pilots kept taking off, arming whatever weapons they could find. Bombs, torpedoes, rockets, even just strafing with machine guns when they ran out of everything else. Kurita's flagship came under attack from directions he couldn't even count. Planes diving from above, destroyers charging from the flanks, even the escort carriers themselves firing their single small-caliber deck guns in defiance. And beyond the immediate battle, on the horizon, he could see more American ships arriving, more carriers, more destroyers, more aircraft filling the sky. The breaking point. What neither Kurita nor his staff knew was that those ships on the horizon were mostly the same escort carriers from other Taffy groups, maneuvering, appearing, disappearing, creating the illusion of even greater numbers than actually existed. But the illusion didn't matter, because the reality was already overwhelming. Whether there were 64 carriers or only 18 in immediate striking range, the fundamental truth remained unchanged. Japan was fighting a power that could afford to lose ships and still have reserves that outnumbered Japan's entire remaining fleet. At 9:20 a.m., with victory almost in his grasp, with American escort carriers limping away trailing smoke, Admiral Kurita made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his fleet to withdraw. His officers were stunned. They'd broken through. The American landing forces lay vulnerable just beyond the horizon. Why retreat now? But Kurita had seen something his subordinates hadn't fully processed. He'd seen the waves of aircraft that never seemed to stop. He'd seen his ships damaged faster than his crews could repair them. He'd seen the Musashi go down under weight of steel that no single nation should have been able to deliver. And he'd realized that even if he broke through, even if he devastated the landing forces, it wouldn't matter. America would just land more troops, send more supplies, deploy more carriers. Japan couldn't win by destroying American ships because America had more ships than Japan had ammunition. The weight of industrial might. The Battle of Leyte Gulf lasted 4 days and involved hundreds of ships across 4 separate major engagements. When it ended, Japan had lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, roughly 1/3 of their entire remaining naval force. They'd also lost something less tangible, but perhaps more important: the illusion that superior spirit and tactical excellence could overcome material disadvantage. American losses were significant: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. But within weeks, those losses were replaced. Within months, the fleet was larger than it had been before the battle. Japanese losses could never be replaced. The carriers they lost at Leyte Gulf were carriers that had taken years to build and train air crews for. The experienced sailors who went down with those ships represented institutional knowledge that couldn't be recreated. But here's what struck me most when researching the aftermath. It wasn't the ships that broke Japanese morale. It was seeing them. One Japanese survivor later wrote about watching the American fleet assemble after the battle, about seeing carrier after carrier, destroyer after destroyer, stretching to the horizon. He wrote about finally understanding what American industrial capacity actually meant. It wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was a physical reality that filled his entire field of vision: the transformation. This is the story of how I went from understanding the Battle of Leyte Gulf as a series of tactical engagements to understanding it as the moment when the Japanese Navy confronted its own obsolescence. It's about what happens when carefully constructed beliefs meet undeniable reality. But first, I had to understand what those beliefs were and why they seemed so reasonable to the people who held them. Japanese naval planning before the war had been based on the assumption of rough parity with potential enemies. They'd calculated that in a war with America, they'd need about 70% of American strength to defend their possessions. Not because they planned to defeat the American fleet entirely, but because they'd be fighting on interior lines with shorter supply chains and the advantage of choosing when and where to give battle. It was the same logic that had worked for them against Russia in 1904, when a smaller but more efficiently deployed fleet had won decisive victories. What they hadn't fully grasped was that American industrial capacity wasn't just larger. It was of a completely different order of magnitude. When war began, American shipyards weren't operating at full capacity. They were operating at peacetime capacity. When those shipyards converted to wartime production, they didn't just increase output, they revolutionized it. Assembly line techniques developed for automobile production were applied to ship construction. Welding replaced riveting, cutting construction time in half. Prefabrication allowed entire ship sections to be built simultaneously and assembled rapidly. The escort carriers that fought at Leyte Gulf had been cargo ships just months earlier. American industry had developed techniques to convert merchant hulls into light carriers in less than a year. They were building them faster than Japan could target them, let alone destroy them. The human dimension? But numbers don't capture what it felt like to be on the Japanese side of that equation. I interviewed several naval historians who'd spoken with Japanese veterans, and a consistent theme emerged: the psychological weight of facing an enemy who seemed to have infinite resources. Every battle felt like fighting the tide. You might win individual engagements, might even inflict severe losses, but the overall situation never improved. It only got worse. One Japanese carrier pilot who survived Leyte Gulf described the experience of flying missions against American task forces. In 1942, he said, when they spotted an American carrier, it was a significant event. The entire force would coordinate to attack it because carriers were rare, valuable targets. By 1944, he said, you'd spot a carrier, and your immediate thought wasn't about attacking it. It was about whether you had enough fuel to escape the umbrella of fighters protecting it, because there were always more carriers nearby, more fighters in the air, more ships providing anti-aircraft support. He said the moment he knew Japan had lost the war was when he returned from a mission over Leyte Gulf and realized he couldn't even count how many American carriers he'd seen. Not because he was a bad observer, but because there were simply too many to track. The ocean had become an American lake, filled with American steel, and Japanese forces were just trying to survive in it. The aftermath. The Battle of Leyte Gulf effectively ended the Japanese Navy as a fighting force. They had ships remaining, including the Yamato, but they no longer had the fuel, the aircraft, or the trained personnel to use them effectively. More importantly, they no longer had the strategic initiative or the hope of regaining it. What followed was a desperate period of last-ditch tactics designed not to win, but to make victory as costly as possible for the Americans, hoping somehow to force a negotiated peace that would preserve at least something of the empire. But Leyte Gulf had demonstrated that such a peace was impossible. America didn't need to negotiate when it could simply overwhelm. The 64 carriers at Leyte Gulf represented something beyond military hardware. They represented a level of industrial and organizational capacity that Japan had no counter to. Each carrier was built by workers in shipyards across America. Each aircraft was assembled in factories by people who would never see combat, but whose labor was as decisive as any battlefield action. Each pilot had been trained in programs that were producing thousands of qualified aviators per year, while Japan struggled to replace the elite pilots it had lost. The 64 carriers of Leyte Gulf weren't just ships. They were a message written in steel and aircraft fuel. America's industrial might had transformed the Pacific into an American ocean, and no amount of courage or tactical skill could change that fundamental reality.